On an early fall morning in the small town of Willow Creek, the atmosphere still had the peacefulness typical of the American Midwest. The soft sunlight filtered through the rows of yellow maple trees, casting a warm golden light over the low-rise wooden houses and the usually deserted Main Street. On the street, only a few locals strolled leisurely, a few shops opened early, including Mary's Diner, which exuded the fragrant aroma of fresh coffee. Nearby, the old but sturdy red brick building of Willow Creek Community Bank stood tall, a symbol of decades of stability. Across the street, a middle-aged woman wearing a simple gray coat, short gray hair, and a modest appearance, walked into the bank. To everyone in town, she was just Sarah O'Connor, a longtime resident, calm and gentle. But few people know that behind those calm eyes is an extraordinary past. Sarah was once a legendary female general of the Special Forces, having experienced many life-and-death campaigns, now deciding to live a peaceful life in this small town. She smiled gently at the bank employee working behind the counter, greeting Mr. Harris, the branch manager, who knew better than anyone else Sarah's true abilities. Mr. Harris shook her hand, called her in a friendly voice, recalling some old memories that only the two of them knew. Sarah also greeted Mrs. Mary Thompson, the familiar restaurant owner, who had just come to deposit money from her sales. They chatted like old friends, sharing family stories, the changes in the town, as if nothing could break that peace. But while still smiling, Sarah silently observed the entire space, the fire exit, the location of the safe, the emergency alarm button, the number of customers in the transaction room. It was an instinct that had been ingrained in her from her years of fighting, never to be lost, even though she had long since hung up her uniform. She remembered every little detail, as if her mind was still running through risky scenarios. To the townspeople, it was just another morning, but to Sarah, it was a potential battlefield. Little did she know that in a few minutes, the tranquility of Willow Creek would be shattered. The glass doors of the bank swung open, and a young man, his face tense, his eyes vacant, stepped in. His name was Michael Peterson, a resident who was hardly noticed in the town. He held a homemade gun in his hand, his hands shaking, and in a voice that was lost in fear and despair, he shouted, "Money, all the money on the table, now." The shout echoed, tearing apart the familiar silence of the bank. For a moment, everyone was stunned. Mary Thompson dropped her bag in panic, Mr. Harris stood still with a shocked look, the bank staff trembled, and the customers backed away in fear. The smell of coffee on Mary's shirt was still faint, but it was overwhelmed by the stuffy atmosphere filled with tension. In the midst of the panic, only Sarah stood straight, showing no fear. She tilted her head slightly, her cold gray eyes observing Michael, analyzing every gesture, every breath, every tremor in her hands. She immediately realized that this was not a professional robber, the gun was too crude, the actions were awkward, and those eyes were filled with more despair than aggression. In a short moment, Sarah understood that the immediate danger was not only the gun, but also the psychological instability that could make Michael lose control at any moment. All eyes in the trading room were now on Sarah, as if they were unconsciously waiting for her. Sarah said nothing, only used her calm eyes to signal everyone to keep quiet. Inside, her heart was beating slowly, not out of fear, but out of preparation. She sensed that this would not be a simple confrontation, but perhaps a battle between reason and despair, between the courage of a former Special Forces agent and the weakness of a person being pushed to the limit. In that moment, the town of Willow Creek, which had always been peaceful, suddenly became an invisible battlefield, where the fate of many people would be decided. Sarah O'Connor stood perfectly still as the desperate voice of Michael Peterson echoed through the quiet lobby of Willow Creek Community Bank. The world seemed to hold its breath in that suspended moment, the crisp autumn air that had followed Michael inside now swirling with a palpable tension. Sarah's eyes never left him, but her mind trained over decades of discipline and combat remained sharp, methodical, and oddly calm. She read him instantly, the jitter in his hands, the unsteady stance, the pale sweat on his forehead. He was a man collapsing inwardly, not one made of criminal resolve. For all the danger his weapon posed, she could sense he was already breaking. And yet, No one else in that room could see the cracks beneath his fury. To them, he was a gunman, unpredictable and lethal. To Sarah, he was a storm she could still navigate. While Michael barked at the tellers to empty their drawers, Sarah's gaze flicked to the people around her. Mr. Harris, the gray-haired branch manager who had known Sarah since her return to Willow Creek, was frozen stiff behind the counter, clutching the edge as though it alone could anchor him. Mary Thompson, still in her diner apron, pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her face flushed with fear. Old Mr. Johnson, sitting in a corner chair waiting to deposit a check, had gone pale, his eyes darting back and forth in helpless panic. Sarah inhaled slowly, steadying her heartbeat. She let herself recall the years she had spent among these people. They saw her as a quiet neighbor, someone who bought coffee at Mary's diner every morning, someone who attended town fairs and spoke kindly of the children playing in the park. She had allowed herself to fade into the fabric of this town, to be just another thread in its quilt of normalcy. But beneath that surface, she had always remained vigilant. Even now, when she had promised herself a life of peace, her instincts surged forward, assessing every exit, every angle of confrontation, every fragile heartbeat around her. She remembered how Mary would always slide her an extra piece of pie on the house and tease her for being too thin. She remembered Mr. Harris once telling her that he felt safer just knowing she lived in town, though he never dared to say why he felt that way. She remembered Johnson's stories at the diner counter, about his late wife and the way she used to sing in church. These weren't just faces in a crowd. They were her people. Her town. And in that moment, Sarah knew she could not let Michael tear apart what had become her sanctuary. She studied him more closely now. The way his voice cracked when he shouted. The way his free hand twitched near his jacket pocket, not in calculated control but in restless anxiety. He was young, too young to have eyes that hollow. Sarah shifted her weight ever so slightly, a subtle adjustment no one else would notice, preparing herself for the storm that could break at any second. She remembered the men she had interrogated in her past life, the hostages she had rescued, the criminals who had stared down death without flinching. Michael was nothing like them. He wasn't hardened. He was unraveling. The difference was dangerous. She needed to know why. But timing was everything. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation yet. She allowed herself another memory, one that came unbidden, a briefing room half a world away, her commanding officer's voice echoing through the static of her earpiece. You don't just read their weapons, O'Connor. You read their souls. That's how you bring them home alive. She had lived by that creed, and now, in this small-town bank, she felt its truth pulse in her veins again. She forced her breath slow, steady, as though her calm could radiate outward to those around her. Mary caught her eye, lips trembling, eyes pleading. Sarah gave the smallest note a signal, silent and steady, that said, "Hold on. I'm here." For a flicker of a second, Sarah almost smiled. She realized that all the years she had tried to bury her past, to become someone ordinary, had never been wasted. They had tethered her to these people. And now, those same bonds demanded she step forward, not with violence, not yet, but with presence. She let her voice cut through the chaos, calm and clear, addressing Michael in a tone not of defiance, but of recognition. "Michael," she said, using his name with purpose, anchoring him in humanity. His eyes snapped to hers, startled that she knew him. "You don't have to do this." His gun wavered for a heartbeat, his breath hitching audibly. For an instant, silence swallowed the room again, as if the town itself leaned closer, waiting. Inside Sarah, memories collided, the dust of battlefields, the cries of civilians, the relentless pursuit of peace in places where peace was a fantasy. And now here, in Willow Creek, she was living proof that even after war, after chaos, after everything, peace could be real. But only if she could keep it alive. Michael's voice broke, his words spilling in fragments. You don't understand that my boy. He stopped, clutching the gun tighter, as though his pain itself needed a weapon. Sarah's heart clenched. She did understand. Maybe more than he could know. She had seen too many men broken by loss, too many families torn apart. She didn't flinch. She didn't step closer. Not yet. But she allowed her voice to soften, to bend toward compassion. Then let me understand, she told him, her eyes steady, her tone low enough that it forced him to lean into her words. Around them, the others barely breathed, afraid to shatter the fragile thread holding the moment together. For Sarah, the past and present had merged into one clear truth: this was not just a bank robbery. This was a cry for help. And if she failed, the cost would not just be counted in dollars or shattered glass, but in the soul of a father too lost to save his own child. And so, in the stillness of Willow Creek Community Bank, with fear pressing against every wall and hope as fragile as glass, Sarah O'Connor prepared to step deeper into Michael Peterson's storm, not as a soldier, not as a hero, but as the only lifeline he might still have left. The air inside Willow Creek Community Bank thickened until every breath felt weighted with fear. Michael Peterson's voice, shaky but edged with desperation, ricocheted off the walls as he waved his crude weapon toward the tellers. His command for money had silenced the room, but silence did not bring safety. It only amplified the terror. Sarah O'Connor stood with her hands loose at her sides, her gaze locked on him, not in challenge but in assessment. Years of discipline had honed her ability to read danger in subtle shifts of body language, in flickers of eyes and twitching fingers. And now, every detail screamed the same truth: Michael was on the edge, teetering between collapse and catastrophe. He barked again for the money, louder this time, as if volume could drown out the tremor in his voice. The teller nearest him, a young woman barely out of college, fumbled with the drawer, her fingers slipping as she tried to scoop out bundles of bills. Tears welled in her eyes, and Michael's frantic energy only magnified her panic. Sarah's focus shifted from Michael to the others in the room. Mary Thompson had her back pressed against the wall, clutching her purse like a shield, her face pale. Mr. Harris was frozen in place, his jaw tight, eyes flickering toward Sarah as if begging her to intervene. Old Mr. Johnson had sagged into his chair, his breathing shallow, his age showing more in this moment of stress than in all the years Sarah had known him. She understood their fear. Ordinary people were not built to stand this close to chaos. But Sarah was. Her instincts began to map the room like a battlefield. Distance to the nearest exit, 12 feet. Angle of Michael's arm holding the gun, unsteady, drifting lower every few seconds. Objects that could serve as distraction, a heavy pen holder on the counter, a stack of pamphlets by the entrance. And then, like a flare in her mind, she noticed the old man in the corner slump further, his hand pressed dramatically against his chest. Mr. Johnson, though frail, was not helpless. Sarah had seen that spark in him before, the quiet stubbornness of someone who had lived through wars of his own. Now, whether by instinct or cunning, he was pretending to faint. Michael's eyes snapped toward the movement. His grip tightened, his attention momentarily torn. It was the crack Sarah had been waiting for. In her mind, time slowed to a crawl. Every calculation crystallized. She stepped forward with a swiftness masked by calm, her body a coil of precision. Before Michael could process her movement, Sarah's hand shot out, seizing his wrist, twisting with practiced force. The gun clattered to the floor, skidding under the counter. Gasps filled the room, but there was no time to celebrate. Michael's panic ignited into raw survival. With a guttural cry, he reached into his pocket and yanked out a knife, the blade flashing under the fluorescent lights. His swing was wild, fueled by desperation rather than skill, but desperation made it no less deadly. Sarah moved with fluid grace, sidestepping the arc, her hand locking onto his arm, using his own momentum to force him down. The knife scraped against the tiled floor, inches from Mary's feet, before Sarah kicked it out of reach. In one seamless motion, she pinned Michael's arm behind his back, pressing him against the cold ground. His chest heaved, his voice breaking into sobs, not curses. And then, in that brokenness, Words spilled from him like a dam shattering. Please why son he's dying. The room froze again, but this time it wasn't fear that silenced them. It was the weight of truth in Michael's voice, the anguish that stripped away the mask of a criminal and revealed a father drowning in despair. Sarah's grip did not loosen, but her expression shifted. She had seen this before in war zones, in interrogation rooms, in faces of men who had chosen violence not out of malice, but out of unbearable loss. She leaned closer, her voice steady, not harsh. Talk to me, Michael. Tell me what's happening. His body shuddered beneath her hold. He's 8 years old. He needs surgery. They told me it would cost more than I'll ever have. I tried everything. No one would help. I had no choice. His sobs echoed through the sterile lobby, wrapping around the bystanders, changing the shape of their fear into something more complicated, something heavier. Mary lowered her hand from her mouth, her eyes glistening. Mr. Harris blinked rapidly, his authority as manager suddenly meaningless against the raw humanity spilling onto his bank floor. Even the young teller who had been shaking with terror now stared with pity. Sarah did not let go of Michael's arm, but she softened her stance just enough to show she was listening, not condemning. There's always a choice, she told him quietly. This isn't the way. You're a father. Your boy needs you alive, not locked away or worse. Michael squeezed his eyes shut, tears streaking his cheeks. What else was I supposed to do? Watch him die. Sarah's heart clenched at his words. Memories flickered in her own mind, faces she couldn't save, missions that ended in tragedy despite all her training. She knew the weight of helplessness, the way it gnawed at the soul. But she also knew that surrendering to desperation destroyed more than it saved. She tightened her hold, not to hurt him, but to ground him. You fight for him by living, she said firmly. You fight by finding another way. This? Her voice cut through the room with quiet conviction. This only takes you away from him faster. Around them, the bystanders began to shift. Fear was giving way to something else, recognition, perhaps even forgiveness. They saw not just a failed robbery, but a man undone by love for his child. Sarah met Michael's eyes, forcing him to see her resolve. Let me help you, she said. But you need to stop this now. For a heartbeat, the room was still. Then, slowly, Michael's body slackened beneath her grip. His resistance ebbed away, replaced by exhaustion so profound it seemed to hollow him out. He stopped fighting. He stopped running. He just wept. Sarah kept her hold until she was certain he was no longer a threat, then gently pulled him upright, steadying him like a comrade more than a criminal. His shoulders shook with quiet sobs, his words barely a whisper. I just wanted to save him. Sarah's voice softened further, almost maternal. Then let this be the first step toward that. Don't throw away your chance to be there for him. Behind her, Mr. Harris quietly moved toward the phone to call the police, but his eyes lingered on Sarah, full of gratitude and something like awe. Mary approached cautiously, her fear replaced by a fierce empathy, as though she too understood what it meant to fight for family. The atmosphere of the bank had shifted. What began as terror had transformed into a fragile kind of solidarity, bound not by fear of a robber but by recognition of the broken father he truly was. Sarah knew this was far from over. The law would come. Michael would face consequences. But in that moment, what mattered was that no blood had been spilled, no lives had been lost, and perhaps just perhaps a path had opened for redemption. As she stood there, holding the weight of Michael's despair and the fragile hope of the people around her, Sarah felt the strange, haunting echo of her past. She had fought on distant battlefields, but this fight, here in Willow Creek, was different. This was not about nations or politics. It was about humanity. And for the first time in a long while, she felt she was exactly where she was meant to be. The sound of sirens grew faint in the distance, carried on the late afternoon air that filtered through the thin glass of Willow Creek Community Bank, but inside the lobby everything felt suspended in a fragile stillness, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Sarah O'Connor kept her steady grip on Michael Peterson, her hand firm on his arm while his body sagged in exhaustion, not from physical defeat but from the emotional collapse that came when desperation finally surrendered to reality. His tears stained the polished floor as he murmured incoherent fragments, words tangled in grief and shame, and though the customers and staff stood only a few feet away, none of them dared to interrupt, for they sensed instinctively that this was no longer the scene of a crime but the confession of a broken man. Sarah's eyes softened but remained sharp, a paradox born of years navigating chaos, compassion entwined with vigilance. She had seen this look before, in dusty villages overseas where men with empty pockets and sick children picked up weapons because hope had abandoned them. Michael's story was no less tragic, though it unfolded not in war-torn deserts but in the quiet streets of Willow Creek. "Look at me," she said, her voice low but commanding, and slowly Michael raised his head, his eyes red-rimmed, his face pale and wet. "Tell me about your son. Tell me everything." The words unlocked him. He spoke in gasps, halting yet unstoppable, the dam fully broken now. His boy's name was Daniel, 8 years old, bright-eyed and full of life until the illness began to steal it away. Doctors had diagnosed a rare condition, something that could only be treated with an expensive surgery in a hospital miles away. Insurance had covered nothing. He had begged for loans, applied for aid, knocked on doors, but every door had slammed shut in his face. Friends offered sympathy but no solutions. Employers shook their heads. Time slipped away, and his son grew weaker, and every night Michael sat by the bedside listening to Daniel's shallow breaths while the clock ticked mercilessly. "I couldn't just sit there," Michael choked out, his voice cracking under the weight of memory. "I couldn't watch him fade. I thought if I just got enough money, just this once, I could save him. I wasn't thinking about myself. I wasn't thinking about prison. I only saw his face." His shoulders trembled as the confession spilled out, and Mary Thompson pressed her hand to her lips, her heart breaking at the sight of him. Mr. Harris shifted uncomfortably, torn between his duty as a bank manager and his humanity as a man who understood the terror of losing a child. Even the young teller, who had once feared for her life, now looked at Michael with wide, conflicted eyes. Sarah listened, every muscle in her body attuned not just to his words but to the rhythm of his breathing, the tension in his muscles, the flicker of truth that separated a lie from despair. She knew he wasn't fabricating this. The pain was too raw, the details too desperate. This was not the performance of a criminal but the lament of a father crushed beneath the weight of an impossible choice. She spoke again, steady and measured. "Michael, you love your son. That much is clear. But this path you chose at IT doesn't lead to saving him. It leads to losing him even faster. If you're gone, who will be there when he wakes up in that hospital bed? Who will hold his hand?" Michael's sobs deepened, and for a moment he seemed smaller, like the boy he once was, lost and frightened. "I don't know what else to do," he whispered. "Every door is shut." Sarah's mind raced. She had seen systems fail people time and again, and though she had long ago hardened herself against the unfairness of the world, moments like this still pierced her armor. She thought of the resources she still had, old contacts in law enforcement, charitable organizations, veterans networks that sometimes rallied for causes like this. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance, and chances were worth more than stolen money and broken laws. "There are doors left," she said firmly, her tone carrying the weight of command that cut through his despair. "You just haven't found them yet. But I know how to knock. If you trust me, if you let this go now, I'll help you find a way." His eyes searched hers, desperate for even a sliver of hope, and she gave him what she could not, a promise of miracles but the promise that he wouldn't be alone. The sirens grew louder, and the flashing lights painted faint streaks across the windows. The moment of reckoning was approaching. Sarah felt the shift in the room, the collective breath of the bystanders who realized the police were seconds away from storming in. She tightened her grip on Michael, leaning close so only he could hear. "It's not too late. Surrender peacefully. Let me speak for you. It could make all the difference. He hesitated, torn between instinctive fear of prison and the faint hope of redemption she offered. His eyes darted toward the door where the blue and red lights pulsed, and for a moment panic threatened to return, but Sarah squeezed his arm, grounding him again. Be the man your son needs, she urged. Not the man who points a gun. Be the father who fights the right way. Something in those words reached him. His trembling slowed, his breathing steadied, and at last he gave a small, broken nod. Outside, car doors slammed, and the crunch of boots on pavement echoed closer. Sarah straightened but kept her hand on Michael's arm, signaling both control and protection. She turned to the others in the bank, her eyes sharp. Stay calm. No sudden movements. Let me handle this. The fear in their faces was now mixed with trust. They believed in her because she had already saved them once, and perhaps because they saw in her something unshakable, something forged in fires they could not imagine. The door burst open, and officers flooded in, weapons raised, voices shouting commands. For a split second the tension spiked, every trigger finger twitching, every heartbeat racing. Sarah raised her free hand high, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. Stand down. He's disarmed. No one is hurt. The authority in her tone carried weight, and the officers hesitated, their eyes flicking from her to Michael. They saw the tears, the empty hands, the subdued posture, and slowly, cautiously, they lowered their weapons. One officer moved forward with cuffs, his eyes hard, but Sarah met his gaze with a warning glint. He's coming peacefully, she said. Treat him like a human being. Michael did not resist as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, his eyes cast downward, shame radiating from him. Yet there was also a strange relief in his posture, as if surrender had lifted the crushing weight of running alone. Sarah watched, her chest tight, knowing this was only the beginning of a longer fight for Michael, for his son, for the fragile thread of hope she had offered. As the officers led him toward the door, Daniel's name still hung in the air, a silent plea that none of them could ignore. Sarah turned to Mr. Harris, Mary, the tellers, the shaken customers, and said quietly, "This isn't just a criminal. This is a father. Remember that." And as Michael was guided into the waiting cruiser, Sarah felt the deep certainty that her role was not finished, that the battle ahead would not be fought with weapons but with compassion, persistence, and the unyielding belief that even the most desperate soul deserved a chance to rise again. The cruiser door slammed shut with a hollow finality, and Michael Peterson sat inside with his head bowed, his cuffed hands resting limply on his lap, his shoulders shaking as the last remnants of defiance drained from him. Outside, the flashing lights cast rhythmic pulses of red and blue across the quiet streets of Willow Creek, transforming the familiar into something surreal. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalks, their whispers threading through the night air, eyes wide with shock at the sight of one of their own being led away like a common criminal. But Sarah O'Connor knew better. Michael was no hardened thief, no career outlaw, he was a father who had gambled everything on one desperate act, and though he had lost, the real tragedy was still looming in the hospital bed miles away where a sick boy named Daniel waited for help that seemed forever out of reach. The officers moved with the crisp efficiency of procedure, securing the scene, questioning witnesses, cataloging evidence. Mr. Harris gave his statement in a low, clipped voice, still shaken by the ordeal, while Mary Thompson stood nearby, arms folded tightly against her chest as though holding herself together with sheer will. The younger teller was escorted outside by a paramedic, trembling and pale, yet alive, her eyes never leaving Sarah as if silently thanking her for being the anchor in the storm. Sarah herself remained steady, but inside her mind churned with questions and calculations. She could have walked away now, handed over responsibility to the uniforms who had arrived in force, but something in her refused to detach. Maybe it was the raw desperation in Michael's voice when he cried out for his son, maybe it was the echo of battles long past where she had seen innocent children caught in the crossfire of choices made by adults who thought they had no options left. Or maybe it was simply that she recognized in Michael the same fire that had once burned in her, the refusal to surrender when a loved one's life hung in the balance. An officer approached her, tall and square-jawed, his badge gleaming under the streetlight. "Ma'am, we'll take it from here," he said in a tone that carried both respect and dismissal. But Sarah met his eyes, unflinching. "You need to understand something," she replied. "He wasn't here to hurt anyone. He wasn't after greed. He was after hope. And if you treat him like just another perp, you're missing the truth." The officer shifted uncomfortably, clearly unaccustomed to being challenged by someone who radiated authority without needing a uniform. "With respect, ma'am, attempted armed robbery is still a felony. Whatever his reasons, the law is the law." Sarah's jaw tightened. She had lived long enough to know the law did not always equal justice. But she also knew this wasn't the place to wage that battle. Instead, she glanced toward the cruiser where Michael sat hunched, his face hidden in shadow, and she made a quiet vow to herself: she would not let his son become collateral damage in a system that had already failed them. Hours later, after statements were taken and the crowd dispersed, Sarah drove home through the winding roads of Willow Creek, the quiet night pressing in around her. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a heavy weariness, but her thoughts remained sharp, circling around Daniel, around the cruel arithmetic of medical bills and survival. In her small kitchen, under the soft hum of the refrigerator, she opened her old laptop and began digging. She still had contacts, people she had trusted in her years of service, people who owed her favors, people who knew how to move resources quickly and discreetly. Veterans groups, emergency funds, charities for children with rare illnesses. There were avenues, faint and narrow though they might be. She typed emails, made late-night calls, her voice steady and persuasive, weaving together the threads of Michael's story without betraying confidences. She did not paint him as a criminal but as a father cornered by circumstance, and in her telling, Daniel became not just a boy in need but a symbol of the fight against a system that too often abandoned the vulnerable. As dawn broke over Willow Creek, Sarah sat back, exhausted but resolute. She had set things in motion, and though the road ahead was uncertain, she believed in momentum. It was better than despair. Meanwhile, in the county jail, Michael lay on a narrow cot staring at the ceiling, his wrists raw from the cuffs, his mind replaying the moment his knees hit the bank floor, the sound of his own voice breaking as he cried out for his son. Shame gnawed at him, but beneath it, a strange calm had begun to settle. Sarah's words echoed in his memory: "Be the man your son needs." For the first time in months, he felt the faint stirrings of something he thought he had lost: hope, fragile but alive. The days that followed blurred into a storm of hearings, paperwork, and headlines. The local paper labeled him the Willow Creek Bank Bandit, a name that carried none of the truth of who he was. Talk radio debated whether he was a criminal or a victim of a broken healthcare system. Neighbors whispered in grocery stores, some condemning him, others sympathizing. But through it all, Sarah remained a quiet force behind the scenes, visiting Michael, speaking with his lawyer, reaching out to anyone who might listen. She sat across from him in the sterile visitation room, her presence calm and unwavering. "I told you I'd help," she reminded him. "But you have to do your part. No lies, no excuses. Just the truth. People respond to truth." Michael nodded, his eyes clearer now, though rimmed with exhaustion. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "I just need to see my boy again." Sarah leaned forward, her gaze fierce. "And you will. But you have to walk through this storm the right way. Let me guide you." In that moment, Michael believed her. And somewhere in a hospital bed, unaware of the battles being fought in his name, Daniel Peterson stirred in his sleep, his small chest rising and falling with fragile determination, the tether of his life stretching thin but unbroken, waiting for the day his father would walk back into the room, not as a desperate man with a weapon, but as the father who had fought for him with courage, not crime. The courthouse in Willow Creek stood like an old sentinel of order, its brick walls weathered by decades of trials that had passed through its chambers, but on this morning it became the stage for a story that was heavier than the charges written in black ink on the docket. Michael Peterson sat at the defense table, his orange jumpsuit stark against the polished wood, his wrists free for the hearing but still marked by the ghost of steel cuffs. His face was pale yet calmer than before, as though the storm inside him had finally broken, leaving behind a quiet sea of regret. Across the room sat Sarah O'Connor, not in uniform, not as a witness, but as an unshakable presence, the silent anchor who had already decided she would carry this man's story farther than the walls of the courthouse could hold. The prosecutor laid out the facts in cold detail: attempted armed robbery, possession of a deadly weapon, endangerment of civilians. The words sounded damning, and indeed they were, yet as Sarah listened she felt the gap between the letter of the law and the spirit of justice widen like a canyon. When it was the defense's turn, Michael's attorney, a young man named David Morales, rose with nervous energy, his suit slightly wrinkled, his voice steady but tinged with passion. He spoke not of a criminal mastermind but of a desperate father, of a child named Daniel whose life depended on money Michael did not have. He described a healthcare system that demanded more than working families could ever give, a bureaucracy that crushed hope under mountains of paperwork. At one point he gestured toward Michael, his voice breaking as he said, he was not trying to hurt anyone. He was trying to save his son. The courtroom fell silent, the weight of those words pressing down on everyone present. The judge, a stern woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable, but Sarah could see the flicker of something human beneath the robe. Outside the courthouse, the story had already spread. Reporters gathered on the steps, townsfolk debated in diners and grocery aisles, and Daniel's name appeared in headlines not as a criminal's son but as a sick boy in need of a miracle. Donations began to trickle into an online fund that Sarah had helped set up through her network, each contribution a spark of compassion from strangers moved by a story that could no longer be contained within Willow Creek. In the evenings, Sarah visited Michael in jail, sitting across from him at the scratched metal table in the visitation room. She brought updates about Daniel, who was fighting with the fragile resilience of a child who did not fully understand the gravity of his illness. She told Michael about the fund, about the calls she had made to veteran groups and charity boards, about the possibility of a hospital willing to lower costs if enough money could be raised. Michael listened with wide eyes, his gratitude mingling with disbelief. "Why are you doing this?" he asked her one night, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You don't even know me." Sarah paused, her gaze steady. "Because I've seen too many people fall through the cracks. Because I know what it's like to fight for someone you love and feel like the world doesn't care. And because your son deserves a chance to see his father not as a criminal, but as a man who tried to make it right." Michael lowered his head, tears dripping onto the table, his shoulders trembling. "I don't deserve this kind of mercy." Sarah leaned closer, her voice firm. "You don't get to decide what you deserve. You get to decide what you do next. That's what your boy will remember." Meanwhile, Daniel's condition worsened. The hospital called Michael's sister, who was caring for the boy, to inform her that the window for surgery was closing fast. Sarah felt the urgency like a clock ticking louder with every passing hour. She redoubled her efforts, rallying the town, calling in favors, pressing officials to move paperwork faster. Mary Thompson organized a fundraiser at her diner, filling jars with cash donations from townsfolk who once might have condemned Michael but now saw the larger truth. Mr. Harris, still shaken from the bank incident, surprised everyone by contributing a sizable personal donation, muttering that no child should pay the price for a father's mistake. Slowly, the tide began to turn. The online fund grew. Journalists from neighboring towns picked up the story, amplifying it across the state. What began as a crime story morphed into a narrative of redemption and community, with Sarah's quiet determination at its core. Through it all, Michael remained in jail, caught between the crushing weight of his charges and the fragile thread of hope Sarah had spun for him. He wrote letters to Daniel, pouring his heart onto paper, telling his son to be brave, to hold on, to remember that his father loved him more than anything. Sarah delivered those letters, sitting at Daniel's bedside, watching the boy's tired eyes light up as he clutched the words of a father he couldn't see. "Will Daddy be home soon?" Daniel asked her once, his voice small but steady. Sarah swallowed hard, her throat tight. He's fighting for you, she said gently. Just like you're fighting. And he's not giving up. In the courtroom, the legal battle raged on. The prosecutor pushed for a harsh sentence to set an example, but Sarah stepped into the fray, speaking to anyone who would listen: journalists, community leaders, even the judge. She was careful not to excuse Michael's actions but to frame them in the full context of his humanity. Her words carried weight, not because of titles or badges, but because they rang with truth. By the time the final hearing approached, the town of Willow Creek no longer saw Michael as the bank bandit. They saw him as Daniel's father. And Sarah knew that whatever the judge's decision, something had already changed. A community that had once recoiled in fear now rallied around a boy in need. A man who had once believed he had no choice now saw that choices still remained. And she, who had once wandered through her own life with the scars of old battles, found herself standing in the center of a new kind of fight, one not against enemies with guns, but against despair, indifference, and the crushing weight of a system that too often forgot the people it was meant to protect. As the gavel struck and the hearing drew to a close, Sarah felt the reverberation not just in the wood of the bench but in the hearts of everyone present. The story of Michael Peterson was far from over. The hardest battles were still ahead. But for the first time, hope was no longer a stranger in Willow Creek. The day of final judgment arrived under a gray sky that hung heavy over Willow Creek, as if even the weather bore witness to the weight of what was about to unfold. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with expectation, the benches filled with townsfolk who had followed every turn of Michael Peterson's story, from the desperate robbery to the outpouring of compassion that had reframed him in their eyes. Reporters lined the back, their pens poised, cameras discreet but ready, eager to capture a conclusion that was less about crime and more about redemption. Michael sat at the defense table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him, his posture both humble and resolute. Weeks in confinement had changed him, the frantic desperation that once drove him had given way to quiet acceptance, the face of a man who had walked through fire and understood that survival meant more than escape. He knew he would not walk out a free man today, but he also knew that freedom was no longer defined by bars or chains, it was defined by the chance for his son to live. Across the aisle, Sarah O'Connor sat upright, her presence calm yet unyielding, her eyes steady on Michael as though silently reminding him to stand tall. She had fought this battle not for him alone but for Daniel, for the principle that mercy could be as powerful as punishment. The judge entered, the room rising and then settling into silence as she took her seat. Her gaze swept the courtroom, lingering on Michael, on Sarah, on the crowd that had gathered. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of the law but also the cadence of someone who had wrestled with its limitations. She acknowledged the gravity of Michael's crime, the fear inflicted on innocent people, the danger posed by his weapon, the violation of trust in a place meant to safeguard lives and livelihoods. But she also acknowledged what had come to light since the boy in the hospital bed, the community that had rallied, the extraordinary testimony of a woman who had stood between chaos and compassion. Sarah had taken the stand earlier in the proceedings, recounting the events with precision but also with empathy, painting Michael not as a monster but as a man broken by impossible circumstances. She had spoken of his surrender, his remorse, his love for Daniel, and her words had left a mark not just on the judge but on everyone who heard them. Now those words echoed as the judge delivered her decision. Michael would serve time, there was no avoiding that, but the sentence was tempered, reduced significantly in recognition of his motives, his lack of prior offenses, and the unusual circumstances. Moreover, the judge allowed for the possibility of early release contingent on good behavior and mandated that part of his sentence include community service programs focused on counseling families in crisis. It was, in its own way, a judgment that balanced law with humanity. Michael bowed his head, tears streaming freely, not from despair but from the strange relief of knowing that while he had stumbled, he had not been erased. He would pay for his mistake, but he would not be defined forever by it. Most importantly, he would live to see his son again. Outside the courthouse, the news spread quickly, and by the time Sarah stepped into the cool air, she saw townsfolk gathered not in anger but in quiet solidarity. Mary Thompson stood among them, her hands clasped, her eyes shining with both sorrow and hope. Mr. Harris was there too, his expression softened, no longer the rigid mask of a banker but the weary face of a man who understood that rules without compassion were empty. The fund for Daniel had grown beyond expectation, fueled by strangers who had read his story in newspapers and online. People moved not just by pity but by recognition of shared humanity. Donations poured in from across the state, and soon the hospital confirmed that surgery could proceed. Sarah visited Daniel the day before the operation, sitting by his bedside as machines beeped softly around them. His face was pale but his eyes still carried the spark of a boy who wanted to run and play again. She held his small hand gently, telling him stories about heroes who fought battles not with guns but with courage and love. "Your dad is fighting too," she whispered, her throat tightening. "In his own way. And he's not giving up." Daniel smiled faintly, too weak to say much, but his hand squeezed hers with surprising strength. The surgery day came, and while Michael could not be there, Sarah was. She sat in the waiting room with Daniel's aunt, with neighbors who had once judged but now prayed, with Mary who brought sandwiches no one touched. Hours dragged like days until at last the surgeon emerged, pulling down his mask to deliver the words everyone had been desperate to hear: the procedure was a success. Relief swept through the room like a tidal wave, tears flowing freely, hugs exchanged without hesitation. Sarah closed her eyes, whispering a silent prayer of thanks, her soldier's heart softened by the victory of life over despair. News of Daniel's recovery reached Michael through his lawyer, and when he read the letter describing his son's survival, he wept openly in his cell, clutching the paper to his chest as though it were Daniel himself. In that moment, the walls around him felt less like a prison and more like a passage, harsh, unforgiving, but leading somewhere worth reaching. Months later, Sarah visited him again, finding him changed. His posture was straighter, his voice steadier, his eyes clearer. He had begun participating in the counseling programs, speaking to other inmates about choices, about desperation, about how close he had come to losing everything. His words carried weight because they were born of truth, and some of the men listened in ways they never listened to anyone else. "I can't undo what I did," he told Sarah during one visit, "but maybe I can stop someone else from making the same mistake. Maybe that's how I make it right." Sarah nodded, pride swelling quietly in her chest. "That's how you fight now. That's how you show your boy the kind of man you are." Seasons turned in Willow Creek, the memory of the robbery fading into the broader story of a town that had learned something about itself, that compassion could outlast fear, that judgment could bend toward mercy, that even in the darkest acts there could be a thread of light. Sarah continued her quiet life, but she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important battles were not fought on distant battlefields but in small banks, in courtrooms, in hospital rooms where hope hung by a thread. Michael would serve his time, but when he emerged, he would not emerge broken. He would emerge as a father who had stumbled but risen again, a man who would hold his son's hand and tell him that he had never stopped fighting. And Daniel, scarred but alive, would grow up knowing that his life was not saved by stolen money or desperate acts but by the courage of a father who faced his mistakes and the compassion of a woman who refused to let despair have the final word. In the end, the story of Willow Creek was not about crime at all. It was about redemption, about the fragile yet unyielding bond between parent and child, about a town that chose to see humanity where others might have seen only failure. And for Sarah O'Connor, it was about finding purpose not in the echoes of war but in the quiet victories of peace, where saving one life could mean saving an entire world.